promise you this won't be a long panel, but I think we've got a lot to learn, and there are these are the two China experts. They've seen it happen, they've seen it grow. I'll start with both of you, and my opening question is, for us to be on the same page in this room, refresh our memories. China was behind us a few years ago. Today, it's a 2,000 crore market, and India is an 850 crore market. What happened where? And I'm keeping government intervention for my next question. What happened where, and how did they overtake us? Take a crack at it.
Well, actually, I'm glad you kind of kept government out of it for this question, because I think there's a common misconception that the government sort of stepped in and just cleaned out the whole market in China, whereas I think there's another narrative there that actually we moved in China from a 99% piracy market in 2010, roughly, to what we would say now, and Katie might correct me on this, but we would say piracy has collapsed way down to 30% or less. Let's say roughly that, but it's certainly collapsed. And that is largely, I would argue, to do with previously these giant streaming services in China, which historically have been the largest infringers of copyright in the market. And then you had the content providers trying to go and sort of police that marketplace as tiny bit players in the market. Actually, what happened is the technology companies, Tencent, Alibaba, Baidu, decided that content, rather than just ripping it off, would say, actually, we want to start licensing this exclusively and use content as a differentiator on our streaming services. And so effectively, almost overnight, and this really happened between about 2011 to 13, 14, you had the largest infringers of copyright in the market switching overnight to become the largest policemen of that same copyright. And Tencent being the largest player in that space insofar as they have exclusive content agreements with all three major labels and a lot of the local repertoire. You basically had that particular company then saying, okay, we're now going to sort of police the market. And really, that flipped the market almost overnight in the matter of a couple of years, I would say.
Katie, anything to add to this?
Yeah, well, I would add a slight nuance to that, because in fact, the exclusive arrangements didn't really kick in until, in fact, probably just about a year ago, right? When Universal was the last company to arrange that. So prior to that, Universal, in fact, was licensing more than 10 different services. But I take the point that the platforms, because of a number of measures, and one of the measures was, in fact, IFPI taking legal action against almost all of them, right? We took action against each of them. Some we had to go pretty far. Some we, in fact, settled, and then we signed anti-piracy agreements with the operators. They had to set up anti-piracy accounts with IFPI. We were able to send notices straight in which then they acted on. So just to share a statistic with you, in the case of China, now we have 99.9% takedown rate. So even now, despite the fact, despite the fact that the key services are licensed, we are still issuing over 50 to 60,000 notices a year in China, involving about over 600,000 infringing links. So, but the takedown rate there is about 99.9%. Versus India, right now for India, the takedown rate is at about 40 to 50%, right? So I think that is a starting comparison for you.
Sitting out here, reading newspaper reports, analysis from the Western media and the local media, find it very hard to digest that there was no government intervention, either a phantom hand or a, direct intervention, indirect intervention by the Chinese administration to get China to the stage where it is. I mean, and is there any reality in that? you know?
Well, I mean, yeah, absolutely. There's no question that the government has played a role, and I would also say, on behalf of the IFPI, have played an incredibly active role in the market. As a company, we're actually members of the IFPI, and we've done major sort of high-profile releases in the market. The one most obvious one being Adele, the campaign in 2015, and we worked very closely with Katie's local office in the market. And as we were releasing the album, we were working hand in hand with his team, sending out hundreds and thousands of takedown notices. And to be honest with you, a week before the album was coming out, we were there going, China is not a policeable market in terms of piracy. Then the album came, we worked with the IFPI at that point to send these takedowns. And these infringing links, you know, social media links, cloud locker links, these were coming down within a matter of hours. So actually in 2015, for us as a company, our perception of what was possible in the market absolutely changed. And so obviously, as I say, a huge credit to the IFPI there, but that's been years and years of behind-the-scenes work by Katie and other kind of elements, working with the government, the National Copyright Administration, to say, look, there is something of real value here that is being missed by China. And I think my impression of this is that the government ultimately accepted that point and then allowed private actors to go out there like Tencent and make commercial decisions around content and say, this is something of huge value, we want to go and police it. And even bit players like us, working with the IFPI, were able to go out and police our content. This was a hand-in-glove approach between the government and the private commercial interests of the industry. But yeah, as I say, I think quite often people say it's a unilateral decision by the Chinese government to end piracy. That's not the case. It was the likes of the IFPI and private commercial interests of the marketplace.
Yep. To add to that, in fact, the Chinese government has an annual anti-piracy program called SWORD-NET, and in fact, they just launched it this July. And each year, IFPI files anywhere between 200 to 500 administrative complaints. And each year, about 80 to 90% of those cases are successfully resolved. So in fact, the resolution rate is high. So let me take you through the process. What happens is when we file a case, say there's a website in Hangzhou or somewhere that we have identified, we show proof that it has not been licensed, we submit it to the National Copyright Administration, they will review it, and once it is identified as accurate, they then send that information down to the province enforcement bureau, and then action is taken. And action taken can be either they are fined if they refuse to take it down, the site is closed, or they have to remove the infringing content. And in this case, IFPI, in fact, works very, very closely with the Chinese government on the anti-piracy front. So this is something that is actually little known, to the degree that whenever each year, this time between July to about November, sometimes my staff in Beijing literally goes and work from the National Copyright Administration's office to extract evidence because they want to see the real evidence being done and to show proof to them that this is an infringing site. So we work very closely, and the government does play an important role in helping us to fight piracy. And I have to say that the government also plays an important role in, how should I say, softly persuading the platforms that they need licenses.
Okay, that's an interesting take. Let's kind of flip this question. Assuming Katie and Ed, the government of India, as you as a China expert and a consultant and you as IFPI, asks you to write a white paper on China and the music industry. What would the executive summary read like? The top 3 points from an IFPI point of view and the top 3 points from a consultant point of view of what should the Indian government be doing? What would be your advice in writing that white paper?
Let's hear your 3 points first, and I'll see if I can add.
Well, I think the first point is you must have a strong anti-piracy program. So that is a crucial thing. Without a strong anti-piracy program, you will find that a lot of the digital service platforms will find all kinds of excuses not to get licenses. That's the first point. And China generally has such a program. The second point that I would recommend would be not so much to the government, but to the industry. The industry has to work together. Now, China despite the fact that, we've got the majors, we've got the big Chinese players as well, and then, a lot of tiny Chinese companies running all over the place, and then Hong Kong and Taiwanese music is very strong. When it came to certain policy decisions, I think everybody came together. They worked together. So even, to use the example of the collecting society, there were a lot of fights. There was a time when some of the key players were not members of the collecting society in China. But having said that, they are now fairly organized into Kafka. And even though there is no public performance and broadcast rights in China yet, the total collections on the producer side at about 22 million US dollars a year, as you can see, is nearly twice what PPL is collecting here in India, without the primary rights that PPL has in India.
Any point?
Well, yes. I mean, I think historically in China, and I was probably even guilty of this myself a number of years ago, was the question of would the Chinese consumer ever pay for music? And in that kind of mindset actually delays progress quite significantly, where you say, well, let's look at other models, let's look at ad-supported, particularly as being some kind of silver bullet, and I think that corner just needs to be turned immediately. The idea that advertising-supported music is going to be any kind of solution, and to turn that corner into the space of saying that in China, the Chinese consumer has now proven beyond doubt that they will pay for a premium music experience. And we saw it first in the online video space, which was completely pirated at one point, let's say 2010, and then 2012, suddenly you start seeing paywalls going up around a soap opera or other kind of video content. And people are actually paying for that. You go, hang on, this is interesting. And then people start slowly paying for subscriptions on the premium tier of streaming services. And now what we have in China is something in the region of 30 million subscribers out of roughly 600 million digital music consumers. So, what's that, 5% conversion? That is still very small in China, but that's the beginning of something very, very interesting. And to get to that point, I think the whole industry basically had to suddenly get out of this mindset of saying, oh, people won't pay for music in China. And now suddenly it is absolutely people will pay for music, and it's up to us as an industry, both on the content side and on the platform side, to say, let's work together to create more value or put more value behind a paywall and guide people into that working, that model. Because to my mind, in India now, if you look at a little over 1 million paying subscribers on the platforms in India, out of 100 million monthly active users across those platforms, let's say 1% conversion. I hear enough people in India still say to me, well, people just aren't going to really pay for the subscription model. And my white paper point would be that is a mindset that absolutely has to change, and everyone has to kind of push towards the idea of a premium engagement with music.
So what are the DSPs in China doing to actually promote subscriptions? Are there any steps? What are they actually doing?
That is more of a commercial question that I think Ed is more in a position to answer.
Well, great difficulty is the answer there, but effectively what happened is you had a range of, let's say, 5 or 6 major services where they had everything available at high resolution, fully mobile, fully downloadable across all their free tiers at one point. Those free tiers were then largely licensed by the industry, but on the basis, within some of those agreements, on the basis that those platforms would move towards creating a paid tier. Those paid tiers were introduced at around 2012, 13, 14. No one used them. In fact, the platforms didn't even want anyone to use them particularly, because at that point it was about user acquisition and just saying we just want people on our free tiers. If you start putting any kind of throttling on the free tiers, people would just jump to another platform. So now that everyone is basically moved away largely from the pirate economy into these free spaces, the platforms now increasingly get confidence to say, okay, we're going to start reducing the value proposition in the free tier, namely lowering the bit rates, lowering the resolution of the files, removing things like free downloads, removing things like offline caching, And typically, as a rights owner, if you're licensing across all of the platforms, the conversation would be roughly along the lines of, we would like you to do the same for everyone because we don't want to find your content on our free tier at a low resolution and then on a better resolution somewhere else. So you have to coordinate to a degree to say, yes, we want to work with the platforms to make sure that our content is available uniformly in a tier structure across the platform. And slowly, as all content providers work into that model, the value decreases on the free tier and increases behind the paid tier, and you see a movement into the paid tier. But it's a kind of a sea change, if you like, and everyone has to accept that it's possible to get people to pay. And then slowly you see people go, okay, well, you know, you just feel it go down there and up there, and it's a very gradual, almost imperceptible kind of move, but it's definitely happened in China.
Katie and Ed, do you see a situation in China where it's kind of becoming a two-horse race, and that's not good for the industry, or, you know, with power being concentrated in just 1.5 hands? Because we probably could see that similar situation in India, and that's not a very healthy situation. Am I right in reading those tea leaves?
Yes, in fact, IFPI has been engaging with the Chinese government for many years now, and the Chinese government has time again highlighted that they want a healthy Chinese music, digital music industry, and in that sphere, they would like to see 5 to 7 providers at least. So for those of you who are thinking perhaps about the exclusive arrangement, the Chinese government came down very hard on the arrangement. They summoned recording companies as well as IFPI twice in the last 1 year to Beijing at sometimes a very short notice to highlight their displeasure about the exclusive licensing nature. Because when you have exclusive licensing, you then, the likelihood of it ending up being a 1-horse or 2-horse race becomes very strong. Where your company's license across the board, then you are allowing more competitors into the sphere. So I think the crucial thing, therefore, is if you do not want to end up seeing, say, a 2-horse race, the way you license, the way companies license, you have to take that into consideration.
I think that's a big message for everybody in the room, that try not licensing exclusives, because you're just jeopardizing your revenue streams going upwards. To try and keep your content on as many platforms as possible and move towards a subscription economy. As it's nearing 6 o'clock, and as the Australians say, it's going to be beer o'clock soon. Okay, I'm going to ask you one last question. Indian films have seen some great success at the box office. Nothing compared to the DC or the Marvel films, but they're seeing good success. Dangal has done well. 3 Idiots started the trend. Indian music is not hitting the Chinese charts as very often you have an Indian film as a number 1 film at the box office, China, but I don't think you've had an Indian soundtrack in the top 20. I mean, any analysis there?
That's a very difficult one to answer, and I'm afraid that my instinct on it is that there have been some films that have broken through, and yes, actually there is a kind of nascent sort of Bollywood interest there, and forgive me, I actually forget the name of the film, Amir Khan with the wrestling daughters. Yeah. So that breaks through on a cultural level. The storytelling behind that, what the message of that film is, it breaks through on that level. If you were to ask me, do I feel there's a groundswell of interest in Bollywood and Indian music broadly speaking, I would say the answer, unfortunately, is probably not. But saying that, I would definitely argue that China is moving from what for the last 15, 20 years has been a fairly homogenous regional pop, what we call C-pop culture, where it's ballad-driven, it's very local content-driven, and actually as the platforms open up, and the audience gets more exposure to different sounds and becomes largely better educated and more disposable income, you actually find tastes really diversifying and some very surprising pockets of interest coming out of that. So I would say, while historically there's not a huge sort of groundswell of interest there, honestly, going forwards, anything is possible in China. So we'll definitely keep our eyes open for that.
I think the consumption is different. So I think that for music, it will always be that much more difficult compared to films to break. But as Ed mentioned, I think, there will always be that possibility. I mean, Gangnam Style took the world by storm, and then you have got BTS that hit the Billboard charts a couple of times in the past 12 months. So that possibility certainly is there. The question is, my personal opinion, because the consumption of music versus the consumption of going to watch a movie, the consumption pattern is different. It will be more difficult for music than for movies to get a hit.
K-pop made a good impact, and K-pop made some entry into the Chinese market. If one of the major Indian labels appointed you as a consultant and says, Ed, we need to tap the Chinese market, what would be your advice to them?
Wow. Okay. Because that actually that suggestion has been made. So I maybe even have those conversations going on. And the answer is that's a very tough one. But I would say that what you might call the classic Bollywood sound or Indian classical music, derived from Indian classical music, is quite a tough sell in China. But actually, the kind of more developing sounds of India, certainly Indian rap, for example, I would say there's some really exciting artists in India where they can break out anywhere, not just into China, but to basically collaborate with Chinese artists on those kind of major chart-facing tracks in China. That kind of open collaborative spirit is actually really growing in China. It's becoming much more cosmopolitan in the sounds that are being used. And as I said, that talent coming out of India will be seen as really fresh and new, rather than the much harder to navigate historical Bollywood Indian classical sound. So Indian rap is where I place my bet.
Okay, so Indian rap's a genre. What advice would you give? So what are the pitfalls? Supposing Sagarika or Asha or Dear has to go to China. Okay, do local collaborations. What are the pitfalls to watch for, besides the regulatory issues and the normal compliance? What should they be looking out for if they want to try something in Bengali, Marathi, or Sairat kind of a combination? What are the pitfalls besides the regulatory issues and the compliance issues? What else should we be watching out for?
Well, actually, talking about rap in China, that's another long conversation, because they just had a kind of a clampdown on hip-hop in China, which has been a really interesting story. And I think hip-hop is still massive in China, but it's now a vaguely sanitized version where people are rapping about how much they love their hometown rather than other hip-hop content. So hip-hop actually has to be largely seen as a positive form of music, rather than going in and saying anything particularly incendiary or being particularly overtly rebellious. I mean, that's just the nature of doing business in China. There's room to be creative and expressive, but there are certain areas where you don't go and shake things up too much, I would say.
Katie, we'll end with you having the last word for the day. Both of you have been observers of India. Both of you, Katie, you've been coming to India since the 1990s. Do you think we'll be in the top 10 by 2022 or before that? What's your pulse? You've heard everybody today. Vision 2022 has been established. The government's in the room. The government's promised to help us. What's your gut feel? We won't hold you to this, but what's your gut feel? Are we kind of on the right track, or we're being overambitious or pessimistic or optimistic?
I think it is definitely possible to be top 10 in 2022.
What's going to drive this?
As I mentioned this morning, you really need a combination of factors in place. The industry has to work together, because if you look at the revenue streams, for example, right? If the industry works together, licensing, the public performance can contribute up to 30% of your revenues, right? So there's one huge chunk of revenues that can come in, PPL side. And then you have got your digital sales. Right now, you heard what Ed said, it's 1% of your consumers are paying subscribers. You know, you move 5%, 10%, you are there, right? So the question is how to channel your consumers towards paying. Now, I believe if you can convince the Chinese consumer to pay, you can definitely convince the Indian consumer to pay.
So on that very optimistic note, I'd like to also propose a vote of thanks to all of you who came, spent the whole day with us. Please do join us for drinks and dinner right now. And thank you, Katie. Thank you, Ed. Namaste. Thank you.